Hello everyone and welcome to the next episode of Art Side of Life, where I chat with inspiring artists 5 days a week. My name is Eva and my guest today is Chris Solarski, and you will learn about the importance of studying old masters and using the simplicity to bring powerful essence to your artworks.
Yeah, I think what was a consistent theme throughout all the people I admire is that they always studied the old masters.
Chris is a game designer and author, originally from UK, now living and working in Zurich, Switzerland. He specializes in the relationship between video game aesthetics and user experience, particularly the physical movements of the players. He is an author of 2 books. First one, Drawing Basics and Video Game Art, and the second one, Interactive Stories and Video Game Art. He is also currently collaborating with renowned artist Phil Hale to develop a new indie game. Moreover to this, he also lectures at SAE, Creative Media Institute in Zurich, and coordinates the International Game Developers Associate chapter in Switzerland too. So please welcome Chris Solarski, and let's get to the interview. So please welcome Chris.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to take part.
So I would like to start with the beginning, because you studied design art for the games, right? And then afterwards you also studied fine art. So I would like to know what is the background? How did you get to art, and the biggest decisions you had to do?
Sure, I was actually jumping around quite a bit. That originally I had no interest at all in studying, and that after failing most of my kind of GCSE Matura level courses at the age of 18, I think. I failed everything, and my only interest really was to go traveling. I wanted to work doing any job I could find. I worked in a stationery shop selling office supplies. I worked for my dad painting, and the idea was always to save up and then go for a snowboard holiday, sort of for a season snowboarding, or save up an around the world trip with a surfboard under my arm. And so it was always I was always just curious with traveling and exploring new things. And it was just an opportunity, meeting, getting to know a person from Australia who happens to start a multimedia course that he suggested, why don't you do something like that? And it was the first time that I actually thought, from all the university courses I could do, something to do with multimedia actually wouldn't sound like work. So it's not sort of academic in the sense that, like how I see chemistry or sort of the traditional sort of courses that you tend to do at university. And that quickly changed to animation. So I thought, animation would be awesome to do. Yeah. And so I ended up going that route. So it was sort of computer animation, then games, then fine art, as you mentioned, and then games and fine art combined, which is sort of my speciality at the moment.
Yeah, but you design, you studied in different places. You studied in Warsaw, then you studied in US, right? And London as well?
Not the US, but not the US, but in, I think I've done some courses, short courses. So how it happened was that I always... I don't tend to think I tend to have these kind of short-term goals, and short-term might mean a year, 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. And I'm usually very focused on something that I really want to achieve. Mm-hmm. And so when I decided, okay, I'm going to do animation, and I thought naively, one day I'm going to work for Pixar. Yeah. And I'm very simple. I'm a very simple person in that way. I kind of think, I want to do something, I'm going to achieve it. This is of course, this is going to happen. So I just managed to get onto the computer animation course. And towards the end, I took an interest in games just through things that I was reading at that time. And I realized this is such a medium with so much potential that I thought, actually, animation is interesting, but I want to get into games. So I kind of changed direction. On graduating, I was lucky to work at Sony Computer Entertainment in London. And then I worked there for just 2 years working in environments and characters. And at some point I got introduced to fine art. It was through an artist in particular called Android Jones. He's sort of one of the Massive Black founders. Because I attended a workshop that Massive Black, the concert art organized in Amsterdam. And I saw Android Jones do a live drawing performance on stage. And I just realized that my digital skills that I'd acquired up until then were nothing compared to his traditional skills, that I really had to study more of this, what he'd studied, sort of anatomy, classical art, doing life drawing and things like that. And so again, I changed again. So it was like every 3 years I seemed to have a new direction and a new kind of goal in the back of my mind, like what kind of artist I would like to be. And after that, it was sort of, not to drag this on for too long, but it was sort of for a long time then I was so fascinated by fine art. I wanted to be a portrait painter, a figurative artist, because I found new heroes to pursue, sort of to identify with. And in the end, it was actually, rather than kind of dividing myself and kind of throwing away all my previous experiences, all the things I was fascinated with before, just through chance, I found a way to bring them together. And that's sort of what my speciality was. That's kind of this digital animation, then games, then fine art, and then games and fine art together.
Yeah, so you combine it. But you said you started drawing digitally, right? Or you kind of...
Well, I wouldn't say drawing. It was really a computer animation course where we had life drawing, but just like a lot of the digital art students on these courses, the traditional drawing part always feels very forced, like you just want to do the special effects and the animations on the computer. But then I was always somehow kind of attracted to sort of just making myself better any way I could. So I always attended those courses, although I think it was once a week or once a month. I can't remember now. But even during the summer break, I signed up for life drawing classes in London because I was studying in Portsmouth on the coast, south coast of England. So going back to London, where I'm from, I would just sign up for summer courses at the universities sort of in the area, and just continue drawing there traditionally. And so I sort of started to take an interest there. And while working for the games company, we also had live drawing once a week or once a month, I can't remember again. And what was really changed everything, like where I really started taking interest in drawing, was after this chance meeting, or sort of watching Android Jones do this live drawing performance. What was kind of holding me back from really getting into drawing was this kind of feeling that I'm not good enough, or like I don't have the motivation that some of my, in particular a cousin of mine has. He's been drawing from since he was a child, and never had any sort of never felt sort of intimidated by drawing, because drawing is tough. Sort of like to be the motivation to sort of go through thousands of bad drawings to get that one that you're actually happy with. I never found that kind of drive to push myself, or I was always intimidated. And it was just this one kind of this epiphany was that I just realized, well, if I sign up to lots of life drawing courses, I've paid for them. I have this kind of financial investment, so I'm going to go. I have to go. So I used up my holidays to go attend a painting course on Monday. Would go to life drawing at work on Wednesdays, live drawing on Fridays, Saturday mornings, an all-day course on Sunday. And just through this kind of this routine and through the repetition, I just started to see progress really quickly. Sort of, it was just really exciting to see. It's just, in the end, it was kind of a funny way maybe to approach it. But once you start drawing regularly, you see regular sort of constant improvement. And I would also document sort of my progress, taking photos and putting in an online gallery. And so when I had these, as sort of all artists do, when you have these low points where you think that you've lost it, whatever it was that you had, you can always very quickly look back at your gallery and look back a month or two and see, oh yeah, I'm still progressing. It may not feel like it, but I am moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really good idea for people who are kind of looking for motivation and comparing themselves with the artists who draw like, I don't know, 20 years and they're like, oh my God, I will never get there. So I think that's a really good idea. And when you were talking about Andrew, that he influenced you maybe as a mentor as well, did you have other mentors or other people who inspired you to pursue your career?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't sort of call them sort of mentors, maybe perhaps in a traditional sense where someone's kind of maybe like in a formal sense that someone says, I will mentor you. But definitely when I started learning, attending the painting classes on Monday, it was with sort of like an award-winning portrait painter called Brendan Kelly. So he's one of the finalists, so I think finalists or winners of the BP Portrait Award.
Wow.
At the National Portrait Gallery in London. So he was sort of teaching me, he was hosting this class on Mondays, and what I took from him was really that, you know, you have this side of art that is very personal, that it really depends on your life experiences and sort of what feelings you want to convey or sort of what ideas you want to convey. Whereas he was a very practical artist, and what I got from him was that there's also this fascinating whole wealth of fine art knowledge, the craft side, that is really fascinating, and that's something that we all can learn. So we can all learn about proportions. About composition theory, about lighting concepts that the old masters sort of developed and sort of have been, you know, passed on and sort of influencing modern arts and so on. Sort of like these are established principles. Yeah. And so this was really like what is a large part of what I do now. It's sort of defining, applying those principles that I started to learn with Brendan to games. So it's sort of like I've been exploring and sort of trying to find this kind of craft, define the craft and define a framework for how to understand games using the same approach that I learnt to understand how paintings, traditional paintings and drawings conveyed emotion. So what was the kind of engineering craft side that the old masters used?
Yeah, that's really good
to influence.
Yeah, I really like that approach. And when you talked about these influences, what was your best advice you ever received, and maybe the worst as well? Doesn't have to be from the same person.
The best, because it's, I would say I never really had sort of this kind of career advice. Often, sort of, because the heroes I had were often quite distant. You know, it wasn't that I knew them personally. But it was always just that this idea, I think what was a consistent theme throughout all the people I admire is that they always studied the old masters, that there's so much that we sort of take for granted from, you know, when we go to a museum and we look at these kind of old paintings and the more you study the craft, the more so if you look beyond these angels and sort of religious motifs, and you find that actually the craft is amazing. Sort of like how they how they brought to life these figures sort of from these 2D canvases and made them 3-dimensional. It's like something that you don't appreciate when you're looking at very photographic sort of imagery or paintings inspired by photography. That when you stand in front of these old paintings, there's so much fascinating technique and also things that make you a better artist. That's sort of what was, you know, they were very limited in terms of What we have today, what we take for granted is like the computer can undo your mistakes and you can zoom in and zoom out, flip the canvas horizontally and so on to see your mistakes. There's we have anatomy references, which are amazing compared to what they had to go through to study anatomy. And so we're at a very big advantage, but what is nice to learn from the old masters is this simplicity. They had this elegant simplicity, which also communicates amazingly well. So finding the simple volumes, the simple shapes, which make your artwork more powerful and also help you to capture the essence of what it is that you're looking at. And I think this study the old masters was the best advice. Whereas the worst advice, I was thinking about sort of in advance. You kindly sent me the questions to think about in advance, and I sort of wanted more to highlight maybe not bad advice given me by someone, but sort of more the general atmosphere that you encounter. I'm sure I'm not the only one. I've heard other artists go through it as well. It's just when you're very ambitious and you have this drive, like my drive comes from thinking that I don't have enough time. That I started quite late. I have to study really quickly and absorb all I can. And so you often tend to encounter people who find it kind of comical that you're working so hard, why just slow down, take it easy. Or people or maybe you suddenly have a little bit of success and you encounter people who've had success before you, and you enter this new group of people, and so you get the impression that you don't belong there and that you haven't proved yourself enough, and so it's this kind of implied advice that you shouldn't try as hard as you're trying. And I think it's none of us want to impress ourselves. None of us want to we don't want to look silly, so we want this acceptance. And it's so the idea that when you have an idea that when you're inspired and you have a goal and you think I want to be sort of as good as this artist, or I want to just express myself through art, it's sort of not to listen to this sort of advice that you tend to get sort of subconsciously or subliminally from other people. So
because even if you look at social networks and artists who has like a lot of following, then basically they are posting a lot and they're working hard, but they are not talking about it as much maybe. So it's just to release the volume of work, and you are not thinking about it, like how much they actually think about it and like studying they put into it. So that's really good angle to look at it as well. And
because because you'll find that so I've really sort of, my memory is so bad for names, but it was an artist that I really admire. She was saying in another podcast that she was studying at school. She was already getting hired by Pixar, I think, or a few people, and all her friends were saying, just slow down. Why are you working so hard? And and in a way, it's like as the professional artists really are, or the ones at the top that I admire, just work 7 days a week. And your life is so focused. I mean, you get so much pleasure from it. You are a workaholic by definition, but you get so much from it that it doesn't feel like work. And in a way, it's sort of you do tend to put your work in front of socializing. All your friends will go out on a Friday night. You're preparing, to be fresh for life drawing the next day or something like that. And so the idea is, you'll often have this kind of conflict between, do I socialize and be kind of like an ordinary person? So in a way, listen to the advice of my friends who, for good reason want to hang out with you, or do you sort of stay focused and sort of really go, sort of stick to the goal that you've set yourself.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and when you have a family as well, like how do you design your day? You know, when you need to structure your time for studying, teaching, creating the startup and everything. So how do you maybe plan ahead, or the daily? What do you do? What contributes to your success, or maybe weekly, like a meditation, sport? I don't know, like all of these kind of.
Sure. Well, I'll start at the last part. That is sort of, I think it's really important to have time to yourself. That I think the most creative solutions, also the most creative ideas that I have, are often when I'm actually not working. It's usually when I'm out cycling or swimming or sleeping, or trying to sleep. that my mind has sort of the ability to wander more, and I can sort of quite literally kind of revolve things. Have a 3D environment for a game in mind, but when I'm kind of lying in bed, and it's dark, so my eyes closed, I can kind of visualize this space sort of in my mind, and sort of develop ideas much better. And so I think it's really, really important to have time to yourself, sort of without maybe a personal thing for me, but even without music, just no distractions, you and nature. But now I'm sort of as you mentioned, so I'm a father to a son, an 11-month-old son, and it is just chaotic. I think my wife and I had trouble sort of finding an agreement on sort of who looks after Charlie when at the beginning. She's also self-employed. And so we found it's just important to have a schedule, that this day is yours. So it's clear that, you're going to try and put as much work into that day as possible. Then the next day you're looking after the son. And so it's just as scheduling. And I think this is something I learned also when I started to shift towards more the fine arts side after working in games. That I realized after some struggling that we a lot of us tend to sort of have some experience at least working in an office or doing some kind of job, and there's always someone giving you your timesheet. This you have to be here at work 9 o'clock till 5. It's in your contract. But as a freelance artist or someone self-employed working in any discipline, it's really, really important to set those start times, lunch break times. Even if you don't stick to them 100%, at least you have a reason to feel guilty. So, if you say I start work at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, if it's 11 o'clock and you're still in your pajamas, watching cartoons on television, then at least you've kind of given yourself a schedule, and you sort of have that guilty feeling that, oh no, I really have to get going. Otherwise, sort of a whole half of a day can go by, and then suddenly finally pick up a pencil and start doing something.
True. And do you use a traditional planner or some app or something what you can recommend you like?
For me, I have a Gmail email account, and I just find it very useful because there I have my calendar. Also for collaborations, I have the Google Drive, and I also use the Google Docs, the spreadsheets thing as well. And for the collaborations as well, we tend to use Slack for sort of similar to SMS, but sort of course, these kind of specialized special interest groups within Slack. And Trello is also a nice way to visualize, sort of like post-it notes, digitalized post-it notes, where you can kind of move cards around and set new tasks and comment on them. And so Gmail, Slack and Trello.
Yeah,
I
yeah. I
find
really
best
like
tool.
Trello as well because it's like kind of self-project management tool, which is really nice visually and quite easy to
Hmm.
plan. Yeah, yeah. I started to use it after I also left like office life and kind of being on my own. So
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
that
yeah.
helps. And going back maybe to the branding and the art style, kind of is there the vision or a mission which you would like to communicate through all your work? You mentioned like being on the shoulders of giant and study also
Mhm.
the old artists and the traditional tools. How would you describe your brand?
Well, the artwork. I mean, feel personally, I feel I still haven't arrived at a way of drawing that I would feel is consistent. That I always get the same results. That you and I got to know each other through the sketch club that
Yes.
I organize. So it's like a live drawing session with cosplayers.
Yeah, which is
So
really
we have a
cool.
different. Thank you. So we have like a different cosplayer from a game franchise or an animation every 2 weeks, and I find it that it's just an incredible way to practice and develop your style or I use the word style hesitantly because I think it's often a negative thing if you think of it as a conscious thing to develop. That I'm going to work in this way because it's different or it has a marketing advantage or something like that. Sort of style, I think, is just more like what you find interesting, sort of like what captures your attention the most, and sort of what you feel is the most important thing to put down. And these live drawing sessions are fantastic because, as you know, we only have like 1 minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes to draw. And so you have so little time that you end up just putting down the essential statements, sort of like that are important to you. And so there's this, what I'm finding is important that there's this, I study a lot of classical art and sort of these very sort of a very precise way of observation. So it's like it has to be, the proportions have to be as accurate as possible, and the lighting as well is decided. Whereas what I find more and more is this. Again, maybe it's got a reflection of my background in general, that it's I also enjoy the exaggeration part, sort of the things that I studied myself through reading about animation techniques. And I have a few friends who specialize in character design for games and illustration, and they have like super exaggerated characters, and I love that side. So I find my drawing, the more I explore it through the sketch club group, is sort of like this kind of combination of sort of a lot of maybe believable weight, or and sort of a very observed, as much as I can in that short time, very observed shapes and forms. But I like to exaggerate them so that there's bringing sort of more life to the drawing, sort of maybe sort of pushing it that way. As a brand, I mean, I have sort of these different aspects to my work. So I'm working on a video game. I also have these 2 books that explore traditional storytelling and communication in traditional arts as applied to games and interaction. And again, it's sort of, I think that's sort of what my brand communicates, this kind of digital art or contemporary art, but sort of really building a solid foundation for it, sort of like to understand what the basis is of what we're doing, and also to this simplicity. So like in my books, I use the circle, square, and triangle as kind of the basis of our aesthetic language. So circular shapes for movements, rectangular shapes for stability, and the triangle for aggression or sort of this confrontation. And this all comes back to sort of Renaissance thinking, or even sort of the ancient Greek philosophy, things like that. So it's sort of this trying to build, it's not just a superficial understanding of art, but actually the craft side, which I find fascinating, which is part of my brand, I could say.
I think that's really interesting. And what I wanted to ask, because you said also that you were reading books and you have these references, maybe what is your favorite book, or what would you recommend people to read?
Um, there are a lot. It's sort of hard. I'll just run through a few that come to my mind. Maybe, later on I might think that I should have sort of offered this one, but one that maybe is very difficult to read because it's sort of written in a very Victorian kind of language. It's the John Ruskin book, and I forget the name. Again, it's sort of like a life drawing guide by John Ruskin or something, or elements of drawing. And it's very difficult to read, but it was because of this kind of awkward sort of old style of speaking.
Yeah.
But it was just really eye-opening because it was Brendan Kelly, the painter that I was learning from, that sort of he used it as a basis for our course, and it was sort of looking at composition and simplicity and all of these fundamentals. But later on, there are loads of books by Robert Beverly Hale. The masterclass in figure drawing is amazing, just to like an eye-opener to understand just how simple the conceptualization was of artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Tintoretto and all those people, that they, you might see sort of like when you look at an old painting or a drawing, you might see lots of complexity or seemingly, but it's actually very, very simple volume concepts that they had for anatomy. Framed ink, a more contemporary look at composition. So just fantastic, just eye-opening as well. Harold Speed's book. Again, sort of, I think it's just good to look up Harold Speed. This is just you're experiencing how bad my memory is. It's just.
But you can send me those in notes as well, like in the email,
for sure,
and then
definitely.
we can put it for like other people to read in a show note, so they don't have to make notes and they can just check it out online.
I think that's much better. Yeah, my memory is so bad that I think it's rather than have you sit through a few minutes of me trying to remember what the name of the book was. It's but much better approach.
And of course, we will put a link to your books, obviously, because they need to read it.
Thank you.
And then what I also wanted to ask, there was about the art tools and mediums you use, kind of when people, they would like to get where you are now, maybe, so they can read the books as well, but if they want to buy some art supplies or start with some software or something, what would you recommend them to start with, or maybe what you use now as well, kind of in comparison?
I'd still just a pencil and paper. It's really, and even maybe you may not even need an eraser. It may just kind of force you to go with what you need. And it was just actually a question I had from somebody at the sketch club on Saturday that, they asked, is it okay to use an iPad Pro with the drawing program? And I said, of course, like it's, everyone's free to use what materials they wish. But just the problem with digital media when you're learning is that, again, it's so easy to undo your mistakes that you're, even if you say, I will try not to, you still will. It's sort of like the temptation is, the tools are there. So you'll end up making, have this kind of, or this general feeling that you're this of safety. Whereas traditional media, take that away from you, and you have to kind of feel more alive, and it feels more, maybe not the right word, but it feels more dangerous to draw in that way. And the other thing I thought was also that digital media, like Photoshop, for instance, also allow you to zoom in very easily and zoom out. And especially when you're learning, you tend to zoom in too much. So a good drawing, a good image of any sort, really the most important things are usually sort of the composition and the big shapes that you design for your character or your series of characters or your landscape. And when you're working with just a pencil and paper, you're sort of as much you're kind of there's one resolution that you're working at, how far your head is away from from the paper. Whereas when we're working in Photoshop, it's so tempting to draw the head and then zoom in and draw the eyelashes and things like that, and you end up wasting so much time on things which are essentially won't make your final image any better. So it's sort of the traditional stuff is the best. And I learnt all the things that I learnt know now about color. I learnt from mixing oil paints and painting with oil, as well how colors interact, the transparency of colors. Sort of what not to do, sort of how to destroy them, how to keep your image as vibrant as possible. All these things you can't learn, when you have like a palette of millions of colors, and when you're forced to just use a few. Or use it as an exercise. It's sort of the traditional mediums are much better, I think, at this. But otherwise, I mean, saying that, I use Photoshop a lot. So it's, a great tool with sort of like, once you've spent enough time working with traditional media, I think, sort of Photoshop is what I use. I would recommend.
So it's good to combine, maybe even if you want to try right away, like Photoshop or other apps or software, then still traditional, like to combine for learning purposes.
Yes, and I mean it's sort of So it's definitely don't whatever you do, don't cut away pencil and paper. It's sort of so immediate and direct. You don't have to change the size of the brush. It's just however well you sharpened your pencil. How hard you press, how light you press is much more a responsive, sort of a much more physical, direct feeling than when you're working digitally. You lose some of these sensations there, whereas your brush, your pencil stroke as well has a real world it's based in the real world, sort of, whereas when you're working digitally, depending on how far you zoom in, it's sort of everything changes constantly, and so it's this simplicity which is very, very important to understand. And it's not just technical; it's really this physical feelings that you get from painting or drawing with traditional media that make you more sensitive to the physical language of painting, which translates to visual sensitivity. So doing delicate strokes, doing aggressive ones, pressing lightly, pressing hard on the paper, and there's more of a physical performance, I would say, which is something that we don't appreciate when we're starting to learn to draw. But as you develop, you realize that there's this kind of sensitivity does translate into the texture quality of your drawings later on.
And do you have a favorite pencil and paper? Something you really enjoy using? Something?
No, it's just sort of like paper straight from the printer that I tend to use. And a pencil, just a 3B pencil, I find it's just, for me, it's sort of, I can get a nice dark value from it, but I don't have to sharpen it so much as if it was sort of any softer than that.
Okay.
But just really as simple as possible. And I do try to mix the mediums up a little every once in a while, because it's definitely important to do that as well. To whenever you're faced with a new medium, you're forced to think anew, work in a different way, and even if you end up going back to what you are most familiar with, you'll find that you can bring a new approach sort of back to what's sort of like to pencil and paper, for instance. So for a while, we also have at the Sketch Club the Copic markers, so working with like a 10% grey and a fine liner, for instance, sort of to lay down the shapes quicker using the thick end of the Copic marker. And sort of, before I've tried, of course, watercolor, charcoal, all those mediums, they force you to work in a different way. They have a different value, possibilities from light to dark, the thickness of the medium, and so on. And so it's important to change. And also, I hope I don't forget to mention, it's also to use these mediums and copy the old masters. So it's sort of like I wanted to sort of include that in the discussion today, that a lot of what I did was, learning from books, going on courses, specialist ones, maybe 1 week here, or or the courses that I ended up doing, like in Poland, which were more long term. Mm-hmm. But some of the best education I got was just taking the artwork of one of my favorite artists and trying to copy it as best as I could. And that's just an amazing lesson, because by sitting there and observing something so precisely mm-hmm. for an hour or 2 or 3, you start to have to analyze, why did the artist do it this way, or what are the connections between this brushstroke and another one? What is the order of the brushstrokes that mm-hmm. they achieved? And how is the composition working? Yeah. And so that's an education you can have practically for free. And so it's those things, sort of those pencil and paper ideally, but sort of also just studying the old masters in a very simple way. Taking a book or going to the museum is also very important.
Yeah, I think that's really good, because then now you can also find online any image you want and you can study.
Yes.
And then we talked about the studying and practice, but what I also wanted to ask you is how do you find new paid projects or new jobs? Because now you are in Zurich, or maybe how did you get here, or how do you basically find new income?
Sure. It's not, at the moment it's quite tough, because I'm putting all my money into creating a prototype for my video game project. But things have gotten a little easier finding work since my 2 books that I published have been sort of quite successful. And so I often get invited to speak at conferences. I get some royalties, of course. I would sort of see it more as sort of pocket money from the books. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just through teaching, actually, but living in Switzerland, the pay is sort of higher than in other countries. But then I live very simply, sort of like really, sort of, as mentioned, I don't go out too much. I live have so I will joke, sort of just socks with holes in them. Sort of, it's that sort of like really simple living, because all my money goes into my projects. So when I work part time, sort of teaching, it sort of gives me enough money to just get by and focus on projects that I hope will bring more money in the future. But it's sort of just, in a way, in my position, I'm quite lucky, because it's the 2 books are very educational, and they apply to a lot of different disciplines, not just games, mm-hmm. But film and virtual reality and gamification and so on. And so I can often even propose talks or things like that, and that's also gives me some extra kind of pocket money to keep going.
Yeah, so you combine different income sources, so book,
yes, yeah. I mean, it's the goal now is really to get this prototype made, and I'm very lucky that the artist I'm collaborating with is actually one of my heroes. So he was, I would have his postcards of his artwork on my wall. Oh, wow. When I was learning to paint. I would. I was thinking, one day I want to be like Phil Hale, and I had a few other artists like Justin Mortimer as well, and so now I'm actually collaborating with him. So I'm interpreting one of his characters that he's done a painting series of called Johnny Badhair, mm-hmm. And because it's partly his work, it's an interesting video game project. We have some really exciting people collaborating from film. So people who've worked on Avatar and Fight Club and the Matrix. Sort of they're
cool.
doing in the special effects area.
Yeah.
They're actually doing collaborating on our game and doing sort of the programming and art and motion capture. And so it's also because it's an exciting project. It's often they very, very kindly give me kind of friends rates. So I don't pay what Industrial Light and Magic might pay for their services. It's sort of like, so that's another way to, it's not to do with making money, but it's also like how do I make my projects happen, and it's sort of like through a generosity, a very, very generosity of people who are interested in making things happen that they're also excited about. So.
Yeah, but then because you are like when you are now, but when you just finished studies, how did you get to the projects you wanted to work on, or kind of how did you find the first new paid projects? Did you do networking or social marketing, or like how did you do it?
Well, the first one was because when I graduated, I was very, very lucky to get a job at Sony Computer Entertainment in London, and that was just 2 months later.
Wow.
So, but it felt like a very long time. And what I should say is, it was very depressing. I think because a very depressing time because. So I think it's something that people don't tend to talk about is that when you finish studying. Especially in England, I'm not sure if it's so much the same as everywhere else, but you tend to leave your family home and you go to a new city maybe to study, and you build up a whole new network of friends and you're with them for 3 years. And then you graduate after working really hard on your final project, and then everyone kind of dissipates and goes back to their hometown, and you're suddenly on your own. And you have this pressure of like, I've studied so long to be a games artist or an animator, and you get your first rejection, and then you get another rejection, and it can be very, very depressing, and you feel terrified. And in the end, I was only without a job for 2 months, which is nothing, but it feels like eternity when you're waiting for that opportunity to come through. And in general, like since then, I've realized, that sort of goals that I achieve, can be 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead. That it's the people I admire are almost always much, much older than me, and so they've gone, they've put in a lot of work that you don't necessarily see. But I was just lucky to get that job because one of my school friends had already done an apprenticeship at Sony, and so he was already working there, and I just managed to get my CV to one of the art leads directly, as opposed to going through an agency. So it's just generally, it's I'm sure a lot of people say it's just through friends is the best way, and just to always be very positive. Even when you don't get the answer that you want, sort of be humble and say, thank you for your time. Because even on my side, like I get so many emails, sometimes people asking for advice on how to get into games, and sometimes I'll write them a lengthy email and then I won't hear anything from them.
So no
and then they'll write again a few months later with another question, and I think, why? Well, you didn't write it back to me beforehand. Why should I? I'm not like a customer service center. So it's to always, people, put time into, if someone writes back to you, so even if it's not the answer that you like, so to always be positive, and if you don't hear anything from somebody, just write again. Often people are so busy that it's important to, just follow up and show that you're enthusiastic, because then that's another key thing that people enjoy, that someone shows real passion for a particular position. And also contact artists that you admire, because we sort of tend to be quite lonely. So I say that sort of jokingly, but artists, as I said, are working by themselves, and they actually enjoy contact from people who appreciate their work. And so you'll be surprised that some of the artists that you think are gods or untouchable, if you write them an email, you might be pleasantly surprised that they write back and then give you some advice, or even just the contact will be inspiring and push you to in a new direction.
Yeah. So now everyone will contact you. You will have hundreds of emails. Yeah, but I think that's really good advice because, you never know. And then also it's really good to follow up because sometimes people read the email, maybe they don't have time to reply right away. And then it might get lost in the other emails. So that's really good. Yeah. And as I don't want...
Sorry, on the plus side, sorry to interrupt. I also wanted to say, so on that's the positive thing, but also just sometimes you'll get very negative responses, or going to conferences as well. Sometimes you meet your heroes and they're exactly how you wanted them to be, imagine them to be, or even better. But sometimes they turn out to be really nasty people that. And it's also not to take it personally. So just some people don't know how to behave correctly, and a little bit of success goes to their head. And also, it's not to think that you don't belong there. It's just some people might have written a good book or made a good game or are good at art, but not to take the negative attitude that you sometimes might come across as a sign of acceptance or not. Yeah. So it's that's once you find a nice person, so it's nice, but also just not to be intimidated to reach out. That's one bad response shouldn't put you off being outgoing and making as many friends as possible, because that's really very important in the long term for your career.
For sure, yeah. Because also they might just have a bad day. Also, that can happen too. So you never know. Yeah. But
although I've met some very people who I'd rather not meet again, but who are surprisingly kind of arrogant. So it does happen. So, but it's a lot of the time it's a very positive experience.
Yeah. And as I don't want to hold you too long, so I would like to have some final questions, maybe about the future. And I would like to know, where would you see yourself in 5 years? What would be kind of your dream goal? And if you cannot fail, where would you be in 5 years?
Well, the project I'm doing now is like a dream come true. So I'm collaborating with one of my heroes, Phil Hale, and but not how I imagine. I thought I would be a figurative painter one day, so competing against, competing in a positive way at sort of the National Portrait Gallery, the BP Portrait Award or something. Whereas now I'm actually making a video game with him using my the specialization of classical art and games to sort of translate. And I mean, I would just be happy to make that game sort of awesome. So how I imagine it to be, sort of, or even better, sort of based on sort of what we have already. And then just to continue, I mean, there are so many sort of comic artists or illustrators and musicians that I would love to kind of keep the momentum going. So, assuming the game is a success, then I can use that as a way to show that, I have a unique way of creating games, that it's sort of perhaps not the traditional kind of shooting, platforming, Assassin's Creed style games, but they're actually games that try to, in a very sensitive way, interpret a traditional painting series or music based on sort of the techniques that I've developed. So I have a few names in mind, but maybe I don't want to embarrass myself and sort of say. But I usually sort of think I tend to think very big.
That's good.
Because I've heard it said before, and as is the theme of this interview, I forget the name of who it was, but it's sort of just the thinking that you should think. Maybe it was even Steve Jobs or someone like that. But it was that you should always think kind of 1,000%. Something that is just ridiculous, and everyone thinks, this guy is a clown. He's never going to achieve that. Because even your 10% is going to be amazing,
Yeah.
much better than everybody else's. That's because life tends to create a lot of friction. That whatever you try to do, there's money involved, there's time, finances, health, all these things. So your idea always has this, gets chipped away, sort of, it starts to become much smaller.
Yeah.
So if your goal is very average or it's kind of very safe, you're only going to achieve 10% of that very safe goal.
Yeah.
Whereas if your goal is incredible and it's sort of going to change the world some way, then even your 10% is going to be better than everybody else's attempt. So that's how I tend to think.
For sure, yeah, because I also heard when you want to be like millionaire, then you should learn from billionaires. So kind of to reach higher level and then just to learn from someone who is much better than you and set those goals because, yeah, as you said, it's really hard to reach them, but if you can imagine them, it can become true. So
yes, and you'll be surprised, that it's sort of just, even on a daily example, to reach your 100% of your goal, you would really have to, say your schedule is working 9 till, I don't know, 5 or 6 every day. On lunch break, you would have to work, exactly to your schedule. You would have to be perfect in your execution every single time. Every single artwork that you do, sort of perfect sort of development. Whereas, art doesn't work like that. That you make mistakes all the time, and mistakes you try things out, and they maybe take you in the wrong direction, or they're a useful experiment that informs another idea. And so this is all time which is not calculated into this development of your goal. And so it's, you cannot possibly achieve 100% what you set out to do. There's always something in the way. And so that's why it's better to dream incredibly big. And then you'll, and make things... and put yourself in a position where it's almost kind of life or death. So like jumping out and, like when I quit Sony, it was also, I want to do fine arts now. And so I was quitting a job that paid fairly well. And, I could comfortably stay there for a long time. But it just wasn't what I wanted. And sort of like deciding to go back to studying is also, just... you hope that something will come of it, but it's better not to think too hard. I mean, most of us are lucky that our families, we will not end up on the street or something. We are, most of us, I know I'm sort of in a very privileged position, but I know that nothing seriously bad could happen. Like I would be kind of kept in place by my family, and so it's sort of this risk isn't so bad when you think about it, but it's sort of good to put yourself in that situation where you have to make things happen, otherwise you fall back to sort of nothing.
The old ways, yeah. And the last question I would like to ask you, it's what would you like to be remembered for in 100 years, maybe?
I'm sort of very proud of my second book in particular. I think it would be nice if it was sort of like became more sort of more and more sort of a common part of sort of more common understanding of how we see games and art. And also the game I'm working on now, I suppose there are some storytelling approaches that we're doing that I hope will be kind of seen as new and innovative. So there are things like, that's sort of like a way to remembered for understand a new way of thinking about game art and storytelling and practices, and maybe sort of like some innovations in storytelling through interactivity.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think
We'll see.
that would be super cool. I am really looking forward to see the game. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and also everyone for watching and listening, and see you next time.
Okay, no, it was a pleasure. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and let me know in comments. Also, please subscribe to my channel for more videos, because I post new interview every single workday. You can also find the resources mentioned in this episode at artsideoflife.com. Just type a guest name in the search bar. There is also a little freebie waiting for you, so go check it out. If you want to listen to the interviews on the go, make sure to check out the podcast episodes at artsideoflife.com/podcast. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and don't forget to inspire each other. I will see you guys in the next episode.